Good afternoon, everybody. This is CyberTao back with you with all things chess. We're continuing our examination of how to play against hanging pawns. Specifically, we're starting with the theme of what it's like when you're able to blockade the square in front of the c-pawn when the hanging pawns are freshly created. The example we're examining today is Macieja versus Hernandez. This is a game from 2012. So it starts with d4, x3, bishop b4 check. So this is the Bogo Indian. So this is in contrast to the Nimzo Indian, which is also a part of my repertoire. It's a similar theme, but of course there's no knight on c3, so white's able to either play bishop d2, or in my opinion a little bit more dangerous, knight bd2. So the Bogo Indian is not guaranteed. You're not guaranteed to get those doubled c-pawns that black so often gets in the Nimzo Indian, where it gets guaranteed counterplay. Still a very solid opening, still very interesting. But I would say it's perfectly fair to say that it's not nearly as good as a Nimzo Indian, because Nimzo Indian is one of your top-tier Pantheon openings. The Bogo is perfectly sound, it's perfectly solid, you just don't get the sort of play as you do in the Nimzo, precisely because you don't get those double c-pawns to play against. So, Macieja plays bishop d2. The nice part about the Bogo, though, there are several different ways of playing it, and each different way has its own variety. Hernandez plays a5, which I would say is the modern main line. But there are a couple other different ways of playing this. c5 is another way. I played all these different types as black. This is very strategically interesting. So black takes on double b pawns, and he moves one of his pawns away from fighting for the center. In return, he gets a certain amount of influence on the dark squares because this pawn is on b4. Very strategically interesting. I'm not sure it's like super duper sound. I think white, with correct play, does get a little bit of an advantage, but nothing groundbreaking. Most sound and the most respected, in my opinion, would be queen e7. This is Nimzovich's original idea from this position. So we just use the queen to defend the bishop. We're going to trade that bishop off the board eventually, and then that queen in e7 is going to support e5 after d6. So basically, black is going to trade his dark square bishop off, and then arrange the rest of his central pawns in dark squares. This is very similar to Nimzovich's original idea for the Nimzo Indian. Very sound. I mean, all three of these ways are still perfectly viable ways of playing. You can just alternate based on mood or personality or the type of opponent you're playing or what result you need. I would say a5 is the modern main line. It's probably the most solid. g3, d5. So this is one way of playing. The other way, this is my preferred way, this would be d6. So it's sort of similar to the queen e7 idea. You're going to put all of your pawns in dark squares once this dark square bishop is traded off. That's it. Nothing wrong with d5, it's just a different way of playing. In some cases, it does put this light square bishop at risk of being a little bit passive. But that's really the only risk. This is a perfectly viable way of playing. 2, c5, perfectly logical. This is similar to the queen's gamma declined. As soon as the queen moves to c2, black looks to open up the c-file to try to gain some time from that queen. So perfectly good. cd, cd, bishop d2. This is all modern opening theory. Castle. If black tries to avoid the isolated pawn or hanging pawns, this avoids the pawn weakness, but it leaves white pretty comfortable. This bishop on g2 is just an absolute monster. And that's actually one of the advantages of having a pawn on d5 instead of knight on d5, is it actually shunts out the strong bishop on g2. Here, it's just got an absolute open lane to the queen side. And because of that, in a certain way, it's hard for black to develop his queen side, because it is a little bit paralyzed from white's piece pressure. So this is definitely a little bit of at least a little bit of an edge for white. Castle, queen b6, e3. Again, if black tries to avoid the pawn weakness, white still has a solid edge. At the very least, white's going to play knight a4 and pick up the bishop pair. But otherwise, knight e5 or followed by knight c4 is coming. This bishop on g2 is going to be an unopposed monster. So really, it's hard for black to avoid the pawn weakness in this particular position. Castle, rook c1. So this is all pretty much modern opening theory, and here there's a clear demarcation quality of moves. Bishop x d2, in my opinion, just gives away the fight for equality immediately. There's no reason to make this trade. It accelerates white's development by forcing white to develop his knight. And typically, you don't want to force your opponent to make good moves. Rook b8 is much better. Just develops a piece, looks for counterplay, leaves the onus on whites to develop that knight without any assistance. So one particular move, b3, h5. So sort of just letting the c6 pawn hang. Of course, h4 is an interesting counterplay idea. Notice that queen x c6, bishop f5. This is actually quite dangerous for whites. Suddenly black has a huge edge in development. It's hard to develop this knight on b1. Rook fc8 is coming, finishing developments. White has more than enough for a pawn. This is very dangerous. So rook b8, in my opinion, I think white keeps a little bit of a static edge because these hanging pawns are a weakness, so there's always the possibility that white can just liquidate some pieces off and go into an endgame where he can play for 2 results only. But I think black objectively is doing okay here. Bishop x d2, I think, just gives away any hope for equality because it forces white to develop. And you don't want to force your opponent to make good moves. Bishop d7. And again, this is just way too passive. When you have hanging pawns, don't play passively. Just like we discussed in yesterday's video of Rubinstein's South. Do not play passively, really in general. You want to be playing, in any sort of position, you want to be playing actively and searching for counterplay. Not just playing passively and sitting back and hoping. Rook b8 just puts the rook where it belongs. Rooks belong in open files. You put the rook in the open file. And now bishop d7. The difference is the knight no longer has access to b3, so it can't get to the square on c5 that it wants to go to. c8. And white has a little bit of an edge. Let's not get things twisted here. This is a pawn weakness. There's 2 sets of minor pieces off the board, so black doesn't really have an attack coming for his hanging pawns. But black does have counterplay. He's got 2 pawn breaks. He's got a4, and eventually he's got c4. White can't control both of those, so black does have counterplay here. I would say white's a little bit better, but I think this is still very well within the drawing range. Black certainly isn't hopeless here. Bishop d7 is just way too passive. Don't play passively. So knight b3. So now the knight's able to come to c5. Again, it's that outpost square that we've been talking about that isn't an end in itself. It's a means to an end, but here, white does have another end to be going towards that the knight on c5 supports. That we'll see here in a bit. Rook after b8. Knight c5. Bishop b8 avoids a trade. Queen takes. Black has some chances to grovel for a draw here, but this is... White's never going to lose this, and he's going to win probably 50% of the time-ish with correct play. Probably more against incorrect play, of course. Rook c8 is another way, but this is very... Bishop h3, this is a very common resource in these positions because this pawns in c6 and d5 do make this bishop a little bit passive, so the bishop pops its head out at a good moment to activate. And black's holding his material for now, but this is very passive. I mean, white for sure has an advantage here, just strictly based off his piece activity alone. And white has obvious ways to improve. He can play rook c2, bring the other rook to the c-file. Yeah, I mean, white's definitely at least slightly better here, if not a little bit more. So bishop e8 avoids a trade, and the bishop looks bad, but one of my favorite phrases from modern chess, I think this is Mikhail Suba, actually. Bad bishops defend good pawns. And you see this in the Sveshnikov, you see this in the Knight over Sicilian, and you see this in this position. The bishop on e8 is quite passive, but when the knight on c5 moves away, it's shunting out, if you want to do a point system, 14 points worth of material, because it guards that c6 pawn. So it doesn't really have an active role anywhere on the board, so it simply picks a safe spot where it can perform a valuable defensive task. So b3, do not rush. When you're in these sort of technical positions where you have a stable positional advantage and your opponent has no hope of improving, do not rush. Make every little improvement that you can before you start concrete action. So here, b3 just shunts out the pressure on the b file. That's it. And then white can proceed with his plans after that. 7. e4. So this is a very common move against these hanging pawns in this sort of pawn structure. The pawns are on c6 and d5, or conversely, if white has the hanging pawns on c3 and d4. That e-pawn break is key, because it's chewing away at the barricade that those pawns create against that Phi and Shadow bishop. You'll see this pawn break very often with the Phi and Shadow bishop slamming up against those hanging pawns. This is basically just looking to create a position where the c6 pawn is completely isolated and white's playing for free. So e4, and this is a good example of the knight on c5, the outpost knight, actually doing something. It's supporting, it's a means to an end. It's supporting something rather than just being an end in itself and looking nice. 6. Bishop c4. This is a mistake. There's an old saw, and it's sort of a half joke. The weakest bishop is stronger than the strongest knight, but there's a little bit of truth to that. Here, I would definitely keep the bishop on the board. So knight c4, it gets rid of that beautiful outpost knight, but again, don't be seduced by how good a piece looks. Look concretely at what the piece is doing. Here, the knight on c5, it looks nice, but once that e4 pawn is gone, that knight isn't attacking anything. It's not performing any valuable functions, really. Knight c4, in my opinion, is much better. And white has a huge positional edge here. This bishop on g2 is an absolute monster. The rook in e4, it prevents both the a4 and the c4 pawn breaks, so both these pawns are going to be weaknesses. White's just playing for free here. This truly is 2 results only. White can take forever to just slowly pressure the a and c pawns, and the onus will be on black to hold this position. This is a dream position for white. But bishop c4, a little bit inaccurate. Rook b5, this is inaccurate in return. Just in the same way, whenever you can grab a bishop, you want to think about grabbing a bishop. So that gets that white's very strong bishop off the board. And f6 is a key move. This looks to activate black's light square bishop here. One example line, and this is just a long line. There's some alternatives here, but I think this is a good example of this type of endgame that we'll be getting into, and we'll see a position like this several times, including the game path. To be clear, white has excellent practical chances here. If you get this sort of position, you're going to win your fair share of the points, because this is a very comfortable position where you can grind for free. Objectively, though, I think black is fine. The bishop has a nice safe square on d5 where it can roost. The rook can come. a4 is always a pawn break. The only way to prevent that would be a4 from white himself, but then that makes that b pawn vulnerable to black's light squared bishop. Yeah, I think this is well within the drawing margin. I think both sides can be happy with this position. White can grind forever, and black can look to hold a draw. But rook b5 just inaccurate. Just didn't take advantage of the opportunity. f6. Queen c3. This scenario, a4 is well timed. It knocks this rook back. Queen e2, and now the rook is threatening to come to e7. This is why this tactically works. And then knight d7 wins material. So, really the point is this invasion of the 7th rank. That's what makes a4 works. What makes a4 work? Yeah, white's winning from here. Queen c3 is just too passive. It's just a move on general principle that doesn't accomplish anything. Queen e3. Rook d8 is a little bit better, activating the rook. Rook e7, invading the 7th. Queen f8. So this is a very simple error that neither side notices. Queen d6 is sounder. And again, this is a similar to the last endgame we looked at. I can say exactly the same thing. Both sides can be happy here. White can squeeze forever, and black can look to hold a draw. But Queen f8, simple tactical error. White doesn't notice, surprisingly. Rook e1. Again, this is another move on general principle. But a4, it's a simple tactical win. So the rook can't go to b6 or b8 because of knight d7. But after rook b4, knight d7 comes anyways. The queen can't come to c8 because of knight b6, so the queen comes to d8, but then rook d1. And then xf6 is threatened, winning the queen. And now here, white has the choice of knight b6, winning the exchange, or taking on f6, followed by rook d7. And this is a savage mating attack. Both choices are perfectly fine. Both choices are completely winning. So it's just a matter of taste. Rook e1. It's just a move on general principle that doesn't accomplish anything. The rook doesn't do anything on e1 that it wasn't already doing on c1, really. Knight d7. And this tactically saves black. So this is a little bit far afield from a hanging pawns coverage. I really wanted to focus on the pawn break e4 and actually achieving something with the knight on c5, but playing against the hanging pawns, this sort of endgame is going to be your dream position in a lot of ways. You want to try to get a position like this where you're playing for free and playing for 2 results only. Objectively, I think black is fine. I think if black plays perfectly, he holds the draw. But that's sort of chess. I think chess itself is a draw, but it's a human game where we make errors. In this position, black is far more likely to make an error than white, because black's position is very passive. He has 2 weaknesses to look after. That knight in c5 is quite strong, even though it's not attacking anything right now. This is the sort of position you want to get if you're playing against hanging pawns. A simplified endgame where you can just grind forever. So I will be giving the endgames a little bit more attention than otherwise, just because it is sort of integrally connected to how you play against hanging pawns. F3, these are just slow improving moves that can go without comment. Rook x c2, this is absolutely an error. When you're on the defending side, when you have weaknesses like these, you want to keep chances of counterplay. You don't want to be trading down into an endgame where you have no hope of counterplay. Rook d3 is just much better. Just keeping the rooks on the board and keeping hopes of counterplay alive. Rook x c2. Now white is absolutely playing for free. There's 0% chance that white will ever lose a position like this, and there's a non-0% chance that white will win some of these positions. Knight a4, king d7, and here, this is the fatal error. I mean, this is just way too passive. King e6 is better. In an endgame, activate your king. Might drop, underline, activate your king. It's one of the keys to any endgame. King d7 is just way too passive with the king. This is one potential line. Black is doing perfectly fine here. That a4 break is going to be instrumental in a lot of these positions. White's technically up a pawn, but they're doubled a pawns, so it doesn't actually functionally mean he's up a pawn. And this passed c pawn is plenty enough counterplay. Black is doing perfectly fine here. King d7 is just way too passive. This is already nearly a decisive mistake. Yeah, and the fact that white's king got to the 4th rank first is a huge edge in king activity. This is probably a technical win for white. Knight d6, c5. f4, a little bit too passive. Knight e8 can be played. This just completely shatters black's kingside structure. Knight f5 is coming to stare at that pawn. This is winning for white. f4 is just a little bit too passive. h5. This is the last error. Bishop e6 is black's last chance to defend. If he takes, that's a decisive error. Or, not a decisive error, but this, as far as I can tell, heads for a draw. And there's no way to get through. But after knight d6, I think... Again, I think white is practically better here. And I think white is going to get more than his share of points. But I think objectively, black might be able to hold this. Whereas after h5, the white knight is just getting on the right track very quickly. Knight d6 is a stronger track just because it creates the threat of knight e8 as well, followed by knight d7. Knight c4. a4 is a little bit more precise and immediately immobilizes that target on a5. Knight e8. Again, knight c4 is more accurate. a4. And then the black king's trapped on a6 more or less, and then the white knight goes back to probing these kingside pawns. But knight e8 is still winning, I believe. King d5. If f5, and the white pawn wins. King d5, knight c7, and then we just go straight into a king and pawn ending, where this is just completely winning. And black resigned here. The outside pass pawn will force the black king away. I'll demonstrate this real quick, just to... And this is a clear win. And the white king is going to gobble up both those black pawns without recourse. So the key moments for the hanging pawns themselves. Again, modern chess has really reevaluated positions like these. If you looked at this game in an older chess book, you would probably be told that this is just immediately much better for white, and that everything that happens from here is just sort of a logical continuation of these weak hanging pawns. We know a lot more about chess now. We know that one weakness isn't nearly enough to lose the game, and that there's plenty of counterplay even in weakened positions. Bishop d7 is really the beginning of the end for black, because he's playing so passively. Again, don't play passively, really in any position, but especially when you have hanging pawns. When you have hanging pawns, play actively, generate your play, fight for counterplay. That's why rook b8 is much better, because it gets that rook in the open file, forces b3, and then you can play bishop d7, because the knight doesn't have that track to the outpost square anymore. But really, the difference I wanted to highlight in this game versus the previous two games we've looked at, here the knight on c5 is actually going to accomplish something. It's helping to support the pawn break e4. Don't be seduced by the outpost square in c5 as an end in itself. Here, Macieja gets the knight to c5 to help support that pawn break e4. It's a means to an end. Pieces that look pretty need to be accomplishing something also. If they're just looking pretty for the sake of it, that's not doing anything for your position. Here, the knight on c5 is supporting that e4 pawn break, which is exactly what you want to be doing, especially with the bishop on g2. And then the rest of the game is, there are some ups and downs and bumps, but it's a fairly logical flow in my opinion, where white sort of takes black's passive position, and then these two weaknesses that black has to constantly defend, and just slowly wears them down. So, excellent game for Macieja. Tomorrow we're going to continue looking at the hanging pawns. I think we're going to move on to looking at positions where black is able to, or this side with the hanging pawns is able to make that advance of the c-pawn, and start looking at positions of how to play against the hanging pawns when they're abreast of one another. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.